The Admiralty, London, 2:47 a.m. The telegram arrived with the particular violence reserved for middle-of-the-night dispatches that change everything. A young signals officer, still in his teens, mounted the stairs of the Admiralty, 3 at a time, his boots echoing off marble that had absorbed 2 centuries of imperial crises. He found Winston Churchill in the map room, hunched over the North Atlantic plot with a cold cigar clamped between his teeth, examining convoy routes with the intensity of a man reading his own autopsy. The First Lord looked up. The officer saw something flicker across Churchill's face. Not surprise, but recognition, as though he'd been waiting for precisely this piece of paper at precisely this hour. Churchill took the telegram without a word, read it once, then again. His jaw tightened. The cigar went dead between his fingers. "How many?" His voice was flat, stripped of its usual theatrical weight. "Initial reports suggest over 100, sir. HMS Ardent, Acasta, and Glorious, all engaged. The destroyers bought time for the carrier to launch aircraft, but the carrier went down anyway." "Yes, sir." Churchill folded the telegram with mechanical precision, creased it twice, and placed it carefully on the plotting table beside the convoy markers. Around him, staff officers waited in the particular silence that follows bad news delivered to powerful men. What he said next would later be struck from the official record, preserved only in the private diary of a naval aide who would carry it to his own grave. Because what Winston Churchill understood, standing in that smoke-thick room, while Britain fought alone, was that those 100 sailors hadn't simply died, they had been spent like currency, spent because someone, him among others, had calculated that their deaths might purchase something more valuable than their lives. And now he had to decide if the price had been worth paying. 6 weeks earlier, the Norwegian catastrophe, the Norwegian campaign, had already become the kind of disaster that reshapes political careers and military doctrines in equal measure. By late May 1940, the strategic picture was brutally clear. Germany owned Norway's coast, its fjords, its airfields. British forces, hastily deployed and catastrophically undersupported, were being systematically pushed north. The operation that was supposed to deny Hitler strategic bases had instead handed him a highway to the North Atlantic and demonstrated, humiliatingly, that the Royal Navy could be driven from a coastline by land-based aircraft. Churchill, who had personally championed the Norwegian intervention with characteristic bulldog insistence, now watched it unravel in real time. In a war cabinet meeting on May the 24th, the discussion turned toxic. "The forces at Narvik must be evacuated," said General Edmund Ironside, his face grey with exhaustion. "We simply cannot maintain them." "Evacuate?" Churchill's voice carried that dangerous edge his colleagues had learned to recognize. "We've just taken Narvik. Now you propose to abandon it? We have no choice. France is collapsing. We need every division, every ship, every aircraft at home or in the Channel. Norway is a sideshow now." The word sideshow hung in the air like an accusation. Chamberlain, still Prime Minister for 3 more days before Churchill would replace him, spoke quietly. "Winston, the Chiefs of Staff are unanimous." Churchill looked at the maps. He knew they were right. France was dying. The BEF was already retreating toward Dunkirk, though the word Dunkirk didn't yet carry the weight it would soon bear. Every ship in Norwegian waters was needed elsewhere. But evacuation meant exposure. It meant moving thousands of troops, equipment, and the aircraft carrier Glorious, loaded with precious fighters, evacuated from Norwegian airfields, across waters that German aircraft and surface raiders now dominated. "The Kriegsmarine will be hunting," said Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, First Sea Lord. "The moment they realize we're withdrawing, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau will come out. Then we cover the evacuation properly," Churchill snapped. "Capital ships, full destroyer screen." "We don't have capital ships to spare. The home fleet is already stretched protecting the western approaches. If we commit battleships to Norwegian waters and France falls, France will not fall." Even Churchill didn't sound convinced. The decision, when it came, was bureaucratic in its efficiency. Evacuate Narvik, withdraw all forces, use minimal covering forces to avoid exposing capital ships. Speed over strength, risk over certainty. Churchill voted with the majority. He had no other choice. But that night, in his private office, he wrote to his wife Clementine, "We are making choices no man should have to make. I fear some brave souls will pay for our strategic necessities with blood we cannot spare to lose." June 8, 1940. North of the Arctic Circle, the HMS Glorious plowed through grey Norwegian seas under a sky that never quite went dark. Captain Guy de Oily Hughes stood on the bridge, exhausted beyond measure, watching his flight deck. The carrier had taken on nearly 50 aircraft. Hurricanes and Gladiators evacuated from Norwegian airfields, some of them never designed for carrier landings, pilots who'd learned the trick in desperate improvisation days earlier. Behind him steamed 2 destroyers, Ardent and Acasta. Thin-skinned, undergunned by capital ship standards, they were all the escort Glorious had been given. No one had told Doyley Hughes why the carrier task force had been separated from the main evacuation convoy. No one had explained the logic of sending a fleet carrier, one of Britain's most valuable assets, ahead with minimal protection. But orders were orders, and the Norwegian evacuation was chaos given naval form. Below decks, Commander Christopher Glassford, commanding officer of Acasta, wrote a quick letter to his wife. "We're heading home, darling. Thank God. This whole business has been a shambles from start to finish. I'll be glad to see green England again." He never mailed it. At 15:46 hours, the lookout on Glorious spotted smoke on the horizon. At 15:52, the smoke resolved into two massive shapes. At 15:58, the first German shells began falling. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, 32,000 tons each, 9 11-inch guns apiece, capable of 32 knots, had found them, the killing time. The mathematics of the engagement were medieval in their simplicity. 2 battle cruisers versus 1 carrier and 2 destroyers. Armor versus speed. Reach versus desperation. On Glorious, the first shell impacts came as a physical shock, the carrier shuddering as if struck by a divine fist. Doyley Hughes gave the only order that made sense. Launch all aircraft. Immediate scramble, but Glorious hadn't maintained a combat air patrol, another consequence of the evacuation's chaotic planning. The fighters sat on deck, many not fueled, pilots scattered below. There wasn't time. German shells walked across the flight deck, methodically, professionally. Fire erupted from the hangar bays. Commander Glassford, watching from Acasta, saw the carrier begin to die and made a choice that would have seemed insane had anyone had time to debate it. "All ahead flank! Lay smoke! We're engaging!" His executive officer, Lieutenant Commander John Barker, stared at him. "Sir, they're battle cruisers." "I'm aware of their tonnage, Mr. Barker. I'm also aware that every minute we keep them busy is a minute Glorious might get aircraft into the air. Signal Ardent, follow us in." The 2 destroyers charged. One 350 tons versus 32,000 tons. 4-inch guns versus 11-inch rifles. Speed 38 knots versus speed 32 knots. Their only advantage, and one that wouldn't matter against radar-directed fire. But they charged anyway. Ardent went in first, weaving through shell splashes, laying a smoke screen that might as well have been fog for all the good it did against German optics. She managed to fire torpedoes at maximum range, 4,000 yards, all missing as Scharnhorst turned hard. German secondary batteries opened up. 5.9-inch shells tore into Ardent's thin hull like a child crushing a paper boat. Fire broke out amidships. Her forward gun turret went silent. Still she came on, burning, dying, trying to draw fire away from the carrier. At 16:25, Ardent rolled over and sank. 95 men went with her. Acasta kept attacking. Glassford drove his ship in a serpentine pattern, knowing it was futile, knowing that every German rangefinder operator was tracking his movements, knowing that mathematics didn't care about courage. He did it anyway. "All tubes ready, sir." "Fire on Gneisenau. Full spread." 6 torpedoes leapt from Acasta's tubes, white tracks drawing lines across the dark water. For 37 seconds they ran true. Then one struck. The explosion lifted Gneisenau's stern, bending her propeller shaft, flooding compartments, killing 48 German sailors instantly. The battlecruiser slowed, limping, suddenly vulnerable. On Acasta's bridge, a cheer went up. Brief, savage, desperate. Scharnhorst killed them for it. The German battlecruiser, freed from worrying about Gneisenau's safety, turned every gun toward the tiny destroyer and fired with the mechanical precision of a nation that had turned industrialized war into a science. 11-inch shells struck Acasta broadside. The destroyer's hull buckled. Men died before they knew they were hit. The bridge was sheared away. Below decks, engineers drowned as the sea rushed in. Commander Glassford, thrown against a bulkhead, bleeding from his scalp, saw the water rising and gave his last order to no one in particular. She went down fighting. At 16:40, Acasta sank. Behind them, Glorious, ablaze from end to end, listing heavily, never having launched a single aircraft, went down 10 minutes later. Of 1,519 men aboard the 3 British ships, 1,044 died. The engagement had lasted 52 minutes. The silence that followed, the news reached the Admiralty in fragments. A radio transmission cut short, an intercept of German naval traffic, the absence of expected position reports. By 4:20 a.m. on June 9th, the picture was complete enough to be devastating. Churchill received the full briefing at 5:30 a.m. in his pajamas in the map room where he'd spent most of the night worrying about France. Admiral Pound delivered the report himself, his voice drained of inflection. "Glorious, Ardent, and Acasta. All lost. Initial rescue efforts, minimal due to sea conditions and," he paused, "and the fact that no one knew they were in danger. They were operating outside the convoy screen." Churchill's hand tightened on the edge of the plotting table. Survivors? Fewer than 50, possibly fewer than 40. The Norwegian coast is still contested. German forces control most potential rescue areas. Why? Churchill's voice cracked slightly. He cleared his throat. Why was Glorious operating alone? Why wasn't there air cover? Why didn't we know Scharnhorst and Gneisenau were at sea? Pound had no good answers, only the accumulated weight of a campaign that had gone wrong from conception, of stretched resources and improvised planning, of risks taken because all choices were bad. The destroyers engaged, Pound continued. Both of them charged the German ships. A caster managed a torpedo hit on Gneisenau. She's damaged, perhaps significantly. Churchill absorbed this. 150 men dead to damage, not sink, a single German battlecruiser, and a carrier lost, and 48 aircraft that Britain desperately needed, now floating at the bottom of the Norwegian Sea. What did it buy us? He asked quietly. Sir? The attack. The destroyers. What did it buy us? Pound understood the question. Time, perhaps. Glorious might have been sunk faster if... But she was sunk. They all were. Yes. In the corner of the room, a signals clerk pretended not to hear the conversation. Years later, he would tell his son that Winston Churchill in that moment looked like a man who had just seen the bill for a meal he'd eaten and realized it cost more than he could pay. Churchill walked to the window. Dawn was breaking over London, grey and uncertain. I want a full inquiry, he said finally. I want to know how this happened. I want to know who decided that a fleet carrier could transit Norwegian waters with 2 destroyers. I want to know why no one knew German capital ships were at sea. He stopped, because what he wanted was for 1,174 men to be alive, and that wasn't available. Cancel the inquiry, he said. There's no time. France is dying. We'll need every officer focused on what's coming. Sir, I said cancel it. His voice was iron. We document the facts. We learn what we can. We do not spend a month pointing fingers while the Germans march to Paris. Is that clear? Yes, sir. Churchill turned back from the window. His face had regained its familiar bulldog determination, the mask reassembled, the wartime leader who could spend lives because he had to. But his next words carried a weight that everyone in the room felt. Send my personal condolences to the families. Tell them... He paused, choosing words carefully. Tell them their men bought time we desperately needed. Tell them it mattered. Did it, sir? The question came from a young lieutenant, immediately regretting his boldness. Churchill looked at him for a long moment. I don't know, he said finally. But we needed them to believe it did. In the Kriegsmarine High Command, Admiral Erich Raeder received the battle report from Scharnhorst with professional satisfaction tinged with frustration. 1 British carrier sunk, 2 destroyers destroyed, 48 British aircraft eliminated, no German losses beyond casualties aboard Gneisenau, which would require dockyard repairs but remained operational. By any objective measure, a decisive German victory. But the report from Gneisenau's damage control teams complicated the picture. The torpedo hit had done more than bend a propeller shaft. It had revealed a vulnerability in the battlecruiser's stern armor that would require extensive repair. More importantly, it meant Gneisenau would be in dock for weeks, perhaps months. 2 German capital ships had engaged a British carrier group. They'd won, but one was now in dockyard, unavailable for operations, precisely when Raeder needed every surface unit for the invasion planning that Hitler was screaming about. The British destroyer commanders, Raeder noted in his diary, had shown reckless courage bordering on insanity. The torpedo attack was pressed home with complete disregard for survival. This is the psychology we will face in any invasion attempt. Hitler, when briefed, was less philosophical. Why did they attack? He demanded. 2 destroyers against battle cruisers? It makes no tactical sense. Raeder tried to explain the concept of sacrificial screening, of buying time, of naval tradition that valued aggressive action. Hitler waved him off. They're fanatics, like the Spartans, which means they'll never surrender. Remember that when you plan your invasion. The Führer's voice carried an undertone that Raeder recognized. Respect, grudging, and resentful for an enemy who refused to calculate odds before fighting. The scattered survivors. For 3 days, a few dozen men floated in the Arctic waters on rafts and debris, waiting to die. The Norwegian Sea in June is cold enough to kill in hours. Those who survived the sinkings faced hypothermia, exposure, and the slow realization that no one was coming. Leading seaman Charles Carter from a caster survived on a Carly float with 11 other men. By the 2nd day, 3 had died. By the 3rd, only Carter and 2 others remained conscious. On June 11th, a German seaplane spotted them. Carter, delirious with cold, watched the aircraft circle and thought, this is how it ends, strafed in the water. Instead, the plane waggled its wings and departed. 2 hours later, a German destroyer arrived and pulled them from the water. The German captain, speaking passable English, gave Carter hot soup and a rough blanket. "You are brave fools," he said, not unkindly. "What did you think you would accomplish?" Carter, teeth chattering, looked at the German officer and said something that would later be recorded in Wehrmacht naval logs. "We thought we'd buy time, don't know if we did." The German captain nodded slowly. "You damaged Gneiser now. She will not sail for months. Perhaps that is time enough." Of the 1,519 men who sailed on Glorious, Ardent, and Acasta, 43 survived. Most were pulled from the water by German ships, the rest washed ashore on Norwegian beaches, where some were rescued by local fishermen. Others died of exposure before help arrived. The Royal Navy would not officially confirm the losses for 2 weeks, a delay driven by operational security, but also by the simple fact that in June 1940, Britain was absorbing disasters too quickly to properly process them. France fell, Dunkirk happened. The losses in Norwegian waters became a footnote in a catalogue of catastrophes. The cost of calculated risks. In late June, with France surrendered and Britain alone, Churchill authorized a full but quiet review of the glorious loss. The findings were damning. Inadequate planning, confused chain of command, a carrier sent ahead of the convoy for reasons no one could quite explain, no air cover, no capital ship escort, no intelligence on German surface raiders. Every mistake was understandable in isolation. The chaos of evacuation, stretched resources, competing priorities. Together, they'd killed 174 men. The review's final paragraph, classified for 30 years, contained a sentence that naval historians would debate for decades. The sacrifice of HMS Ardent and HMS Acasta, while tactically futile, demonstrated to enemy commanders the lengths to which Royal Navy units will go to protect high-value assets. This psychological factor may prove relevant in future operations planning. In other words, the deaths had value not in what they achieved militarily, but in what they signaled. Churchill read the report twice, then filed it without comment, but in a private letter to Admiral Pound, marked personal burn after reading, he wrote, "We cannot afford many more victories like Norway, and we cannot afford to tell ourselves that brave men died for tactical necessity when they died for our miscalculations. The Germans damaged one of their ships, we lost hundreds of irreplaceable sailors, and a carrier we desperately need. If that is time bought, it is time purchased at a price we cannot continue to pay. Remember this when we make our next calculated risk. Remember that the calculations have names and families and will never come home." The letter was burned, as ordered, but Pound mentioned it years later, describing it as the moment he understood that Churchill, bombastic, theatrical, prone to grand strategic visions, carried the weight of his decisions with a precision that matched any accountant. Every death was an entry in a ledger Churchill kept internally, balanced against outcomes measured in time, morale, and strategic position. The question that haunted him, Pound said, was whether the ledger would ever balance. What it meant, the sinking of Glorious, Ardent, and Acasta, changed British naval doctrine in subtle but lasting ways. Carriers were never again sent into contested waters without proper escort. The casual improvisation that had characterized the Norwegian campaign gave way to more careful operational planning, not because anyone wanted to be cautious, but because Britain couldn't afford to lose capital ships to avoidable mistakes. The torpedo hit on Gneisenau kept that battlecruiser in dock until late 1940, removing her from operations during the crucial period when Germany might have attempted to interdict supply convoys more aggressively. Whether this constituted time bought by the destroyer's sacrifice remained a matter of bitter debate among naval officers who knew the full story. For the families of the dead, there was no debate, just absence and telegrams, and the knowledge that their men had died in a campaign most Britons couldn't find on a map for objectives that had been abandoned days later. Churchill never spoke publicly about the engagement in detail. In his war memoirs, he devoted less than a page to it, a few sentences acknowledging the loss, praising the gallant defense, moving quickly to other matters. But those who worked with him closely noted that after June 1940, his questions in naval briefings changed. He asked more about escort strength. He challenged assumptions about acceptable risk. He wanted to know, always, what forces would be available for rescue if things went wrong. "The PM," one aide wrote, "seems to have lost his taste for glorious gestures in the Norwegian waters." Northumberland, 1941. In a small cottage outside Newcastle, Mrs. Elizabeth Glassford received a box containing her husband's effects. The letter she'd never received, the one he'd written about coming home, was among them, still unsealed. She read it once, carefully folded it, and placed it in a drawer with his medals and the official notification of his death. She never remarried. When asked about her husband, she would say simply, "He did his duty," which was true as far as it went. What she didn't say, couldn't say, wouldn't say was that his duty had included charging battle cruisers in a destroyer because someone somewhere had decided that risk was acceptable, that the price of time was measured in men who wrote letters home about seeing green England again, that the calculations of war require someone to be spent. On June the 8th every year until her death in 1967, she would stand at her window at 4:40 p.m., the time Acasta went down, and look north, toward waters she would never see, where her husband had bought 52 minutes with his life. Whether those minutes mattered, she never knew, but she suspected with the cold clarity of someone who had paid the price personally that Winston Churchill didn't know either, and that perhaps not knowing was the heaviest burden of all.